Hey guys, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're actually going to be going over... Oh, hang on a second. Sorry. Totally forgot that I had my invisibility powers turned on today. What is up guys? So today we're actually continuing our deep dive series on the Nightmare Cup, diving deeper into the meta to figure out which Pokemon kind of fit inside of your team. So today we're actually looking at a pretty hyped up Pokemon, a Pokemon that's actually been talked about quite a bit lately, and I kind of wanted to figure out why. So here we are. Today we're actually talking about Xatu. Xatu is a psychic and flying type Pokemon, extremely unique typing in this cup here. At level 40 with 15s across the board, you can max out at 2188. Now you can actually achieve a 1498 at level 26 with a 0 attack, 13 defense, and 15 stamina. So this IV combination right here will yield you a maximum stat product out of your Xatu for the Great League. Now according to my spreadsheets and all the math that I have done, Xatu should rank around 34th in bulk and 31st in stat product. Now taking a look at his actual base stats here, 192 on attack is kind of high, 146 defense and 163 stamina. So he doesn't have a great stat distribution for PvP in general, but we can definitely work with this. Having a high attack doesn't necessarily mean that we're bad, it just kind of makes us a little squishy because our defense is kind of so low. So moving on to our moves here, we actually do have 2 fast moves to choose from, one of which is a stab candidate, 3 charge moves, which 2 of them are stab candidates here. So let's actually get into these. So Air Slash is actually our first fast attack here. 3 energy per turn with 3 damage per turn, but after you factor in stab, you do actually get this 3.6 damage per turn, which actually ends up making us beat Feint Attack because it's basically the exact same stats. 3 energy per turn, 3 damage per turn, but because we don't get stab, we don't get that 1.2 times multiplier added to our damage. Moving on to our charge moves here, we do have Ominous Wind, which is a ghost type move, which means we do not get the stab bonus. Future Sight and Aerial Ace, though, are both stab candidates here. So Ominous Wind costing 40 for 50 damage, we don't get a stab bonus, which means that we are at a 1.25 damage per energy ratio. Not too bad. Future Sight costing 65 for 120 damage at a 1.85 damage per energy ratio. But after stab, it goes up to a 144 damage, which ends up putting us at a 2.21 damage per energy ratio. Whew, pretty high. Aerial Ace being our last charge move here, 45 energy for 55 damage, which means we get a 1.22 damage per energy ratio. After stab though, we do go up to 66 damage for a 1.46 damage per energy ratio. So, very respectable there. Now, out of these moves, I decided to actually go with Air Slash, Ominous Wind, and Aerial Ace for this deep dive. There is a case to be made a little bit about Feint Attack if you really want to build your Xatu to be a specialist towards killing the psychic types and the fighting types. Or if you want to have more general coverage, you can build it with Air Slash, and then you can actually have Ominous Wind and Aerial Ace instead. The problem with Future Sight is that it's kind of slow. Being 65 energy is a lot higher than either 2 of these. Being that we have Ominous Wind at 40 and Aerial Ace at 45, you can use both of those to be a relatively fast shield buster in a lot of ways. Considering that Aerial Ace will actually be neutral to most of the meta, it does end up having a couple of issues with a few steel types that you'll encounter, but generally Aerial Ace will be neutral to most of the cup, which actually ends up being really nice for you considering you can output a lot of neutral damage. Now, Ominous Wind is a little bit better in a lot of ways because you can actually hit the psychic types for super effective damage, and you don't really have to worry too much about it being resisted in this cup. Some things can end up resisting it, but in general, Ominous Wind is definitely a great move to have. So, for the purposes of this deep dive, I did go with the faster moveset to actually give us a little bit more advantage in that area, to kind of show off a little bit of the specialty of Xatu actually using these really fast charge moves. So actually moving on to our shield situation here. So in a 0 versus 0 shield situation, so in a kind of like mock-up like closing scenario, we actually end up winning 44.8% of those matches. Our next scenario is actually for a 2 shields for me versus 0 shields for my opponent. We actually end up winning 82.1% of those matches. But I'm not super worried about which ones we win. I actually want to know which ones we end up losing against, because I want to know if I have complete shield advantage, which Pokemon are just going to flat out beat me. And a lot of the Pokemon that show up in this list are resistors to our damage, or they are outputting a ton of neutral damage here. So some obvious ones here are like Tyranitar, Solrock, and Lunatone. All 3 of those being able to push rock type damage really does exploit our flying type weakness there. But things like Sharpedo, Alolan Raticate, Skuntank, Drapion, those type Pokemon can really actually end up using certain moves that are either non-resistible to us, or they're either going to do super effective damage. Now our next scenario is actually a 0 shields for myself with 2 shields for my opponent. We actually end up winning 14.9% of those matches, and that 14.9% is actually the most important part. I want to figure out which Pokemon we just flat out end up beating, no matter how many shields they have. If we're at a complete shieldless disadvantage here, I want to know which Pokemon just flat out lose to us. And out of that 14.9%, a lot of them are just weak to flying types. Things that have the fighting typing, things that have grass typing, all of those Pokemon end up having a really hard time getting around us. Even the bug types start to show up as kind of an issue. Like my boy Heracross. Our last scenario when it comes to shields is actually a 2 shields versus 2 shields. So when both opponent and myself have 2 shields, I want to know how many matches we actually end up winning here. That's 55.2%. That's pretty big. So what that actually tells me is that Xatu actually does prefer to open. Statistically, you're gonna win more matches when both you and your opponent have both shields as Xatu than when you would actually be closing and you and your opponent both have 0 shields. So statistically, he does prefer to open, although there are gonna be a lot of dark type leads in this cup, so maybe kind of hard to get around that because we do actually carry a weakness to the dark typing. And once we get over to our counters over here, we'll start to see them quite a bit. Let's actually move on to some matchups here. So it's important to know that everything on this board and from this point beyond in the video, we're actually going to be talking in terms of 1 shield versus 1 shield. So to give both Pokemon the most fair shield usage, to give the most even shield situation, 1 shield versus 1 shield seems to be the best way to go about this. So in terms of my deep dives, I usually end up taking our subject Pokemon and I usually throw them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon in the cup just to see how they fare up against them. And Xatu is actually pretty decent. It is a 50-50 split, but it tells us a little bit about what our matchups and our counters are going to actually entail here. So we actually end up winning against Wobbuffet, Claydol, Slowbro, Slowking, and Grumpig. So it's important to note that most of those are psychic types with psychic type fast moves that aren't confusion. You see? That aren't confusion. Alright? So the non-confusion users have a kind of an issue. Now Claydol does have access to confusion, but we're doing a lot of neutral damage and then throwing a lot of super effective Ominous Wind damage, so it kind of has a lot of trouble there. Based on the situation in PvPoke, using Air Slash, Aerial Ace, and Ominous Wind, giving Claydol Confusion, Gyro Ball, and Psychic, it is a close match. We actually do end with around a third of our health left, but it just seems like our just pure neutral damage to Claydol ends up being a lot better put to use than the confusion that we're actually resisting. So we're actually doing 6 damage per Air Slash, while confusion is actually doing 8 damage per confusion. But the problem here is that our Ominous Wind is actually hitting for 42 damage. We actually get 2 Ominous Winds off before Claydol can even get to another Gyro Ball. It does end up using 1 Gyro Ball, but then it actually ends up fainting just a little bit after we use our second Ominous Wind. So Claydol pretty bulky, but it ends up just kind of getting hurt by our super effective damage while not being able to hit us with at least super effective damage back. It does get the neutral damage using that steel move, but in a one shield versus one shield, it just ends up falling there. So now in terms of the top 10, what do we actually end up losing to? Well, there's a common theme here. So Umbreon, Alolan Raticate, Dark types. Makes a lot of sense. Hypno is interesting. So it's a confusion user, but unlike Claydol, it actually has access to Shadow Ball. It actually ends up hurting us quite a fair bit when you factor in that it's going to be using Shadow Ball, a super effective damage move, versus a neutral damage move like Claydol. Now, when it comes to Bronzong, Bronzong's kind of interesting because right off the bat, PvPoke throws Feint Attack on Bronzong instead of Confusion. So automatically it's going to start hitting us for super effective damage in its fast move area while hitting neutral damage in our charge move area. If we do switch over to Confusion though, we still, as Bronzong, just barely win. I mean, Bronzong has 8 health left. So it does still end up falling even though we're using Confusion here, which is kind of interesting. So Confusion here from Bronzong is actually going to be doing 9 damage to our Xatu, whereas Air Slash is only doing 5. It's only doing 5 damage, which is really, really poor. So unlike our Claydol situation, Bronzong does actually end up inching out. Just unfortunately, we start to lose to Bronzong. Now, Metang also falls into a very similar scenario, but Metang has access to electric type moves, which actually end up hurting our flying type weakness there, so that one explains that. Now let's actually move on to some counters here. So in terms of what we should be focusing attention on when we talk about Xatu versus what should we bring to the match to actually hurt a Xatu here? Well, in terms of what we should focus our attention on, Psychic types are kind of split here. So I do have Psychic written on both sides, and that's because it's kind of split down the middle. So being that it's split down the middle, I actually have Speed and Neutral listed here. So basically, we carry the Psychic typing, but we're trying to avoid using this Future Sight for this deep dive specifically. So being that we're running Air Slash, Aerial Ace, and Ominous Wind, if we can at least hit them for neutral damage, it gives us that Psychic type advantage. Also, this Speed written here is basically because whenever we get into some of the Psychic types, some of them still end up being faster than Xatu here. So if we have the speed advantage at getting off this Ominous Wind, then we actually do really good up against them. But if they have anything that's comparable, if it has the same energy and more damage, then they start to gain ahead. And being that they have Confusion, it starts to hurt us quite a bit. So some things that we're actually faster up against or that we hit for neutral damage is going to be things like Kadabra, Grumpig, Wobbuffet, Mr. Mime, Gardevoir, Espeon, and Chimecho all end up falling into this list here. Now when we talk about the fighting typing, kind of interesting because right off the bat, PvPoke chooses Bubble up against Xatu for some awkward reason. I'm assuming it's because Mudshot has the resistant damage towards the flying type, but either way, I ran it with both. Both scenarios actually do end up gaining you a little bit of footing here. So this is one of those rare situations with Poliwrath that actually makes a lot of sense to use Bubble. So Mudshot, Ice Punch, and Power Up Punch on Poliwrath actually ends up losing to Xatu with 11 health remaining for Xatu. But if you switch it over to Bubble and you actually replay that battle, you actually end up winning as Poliwrath with 29 HP remaining. So that's the case that you can have for Bubble Poliwrath. And we actually may look into just generally like Bubble versus Mudshot and kind of figure out which matches make more sense for each one. It was suggested in a comment and I'm definitely considering it. I just have so much to go through. We will see if we can get there though. Either way, Poliwrath is kind of iffy. Being that most people are going to be running Mudshot, I'd say it's pretty safe to go up against it with Xatu, but the problem is that if they happen to be running Bubble with Ice Beam, of course, kind of does make it a little bit harder for Xatu to get over that. Moving on to our what should we bring to get rid of Xatu? Well, Dark types, Pretty much all of the dark types do really well up against Xatu, except for the grass ones. So the grass dark types do actually end up carrying a weakness to flying type damage, which ends up meaning that our flying type moves just rock their world. Unfortunately, if they do not have that grass typing, if they don't carry the grass typing as well as dark typing, then it kind of makes it really hard for Xatu to beat them, because all of the darks basically get all kinds of dark super effective damage towards our psychic typing there. Last but not least, the other half of the psychics. So basically on this front, we end up having problems with super effective damage and resisted damage here. So what we're talking about with resisted damage is kind of things like Bronzong and Matang show back up in this list. Solrock and Lunatone actually show up in this list. And then when we talk about super effective damage, gets kind of interesting. Solrock and Lunatone are prime candidates here for their rock type damage. Alolan Raichu, really good in this scenario because of its access to electric type moves. Jinx, Smoochum, Smoochum's in this list. Having access to those ice type moves really does exploit our weakness to an ice type move, which is just crazy. So you can kind of see that it's kind of split down some weird section of the psychic types where if they don't actually target psychic types using psychic type damage, then we start to have problems with them. Whereas otherwise, we're actually pretty good up against the psychics. Being able to do neutral damage while taking resisted damage is always a plus. Even though it does make the battle pretty hard, it does at least get us to the finish line quicker than not. So last but not least, let's actually go over a couple of pros and cons here. So cons first, the only con that I actually have is that it's pretty bad up against the dark types. So it kind of does fall, but it's basically just because it's super effective damage when you use a dark type attack up against Xatu. Honestly, that's the only negative thing that I can really think about, because in this cup, this typing is really strong, and that's actually one of the pros that I have written down. This great dual typing. Having access to Psychic, Ghost, and Flying type moves makes it quite versatile in how you want to build your Xatu. And that's really, really important. The other pro that actually I've written down is that it's quite a strong specialist. The fact that it takes out all of the fighting types except Poliwrath, holy cow, that's insane. Plus you take out half of your own typing when it comes to psychics. That's big. That's a big specialist role. Of course, you do kind of get swept out with some of the psychics and most of the darks, but hey, that's a pretty good specialist in my opinion. That definitely gets you covered on a lot of the Pokemon actually in this cup. So no problem there. Xatu, very, very strong. I definitely am behind Xatu on testing him, seeing if he fits into your team. He may not actually fit very well into your team, but that's up for you to decide. I'm interested to hear what your guys' thought on Xatu are down in the comments below. And that's actually all I have for today. So thank you so much for watching, and always remember, if you have deep dives that you're looking forward to, please comment them down below so that I can tally them up and get to those faster. Otherwise, that should be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out and so much for watching. I really do appreciate every single one of you guys. Like, really, thanks. So if you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will see you then. You want to see that invisible trick again?